Hi, friends. It's your pal Scott Garibay, and today we are going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons through the lens of Jaws 4, Jaws the Revenge. So this came out in the 80s and really, really wild. This was the fourth movie that was in the Jaws Steven Spielberg. This is a sequel to the third sequel to Steven Spielberg's classic of Jaws, right? And what's interesting is it was widely panned. People were just like, "This was a terrible movie," and and it was considered blockbuster schlock, right? They were like, "Oh, just another cashing in again, and getting more money from the squeezing the same orange for more juice." And the reality is, I'm really fascinated by these Jaws sequels in context to Dungeons and Dragons, because Dungeons and Dragons, when it came out in the 70s, truly was incredibly innovative. But as it progressed, it became absolutely the most dominant tabletop role-playing game in the world. D&D is not just the first tabletop role-playing game, it's arguably the only tabletop role-playing game that matters. Every other competitor has failed to surpass it. In fact, the entire industry combined against it cannot surpass Dungeons and Dragons, which is really interesting. So, what I think is interesting is, and people are like, well, it just wins off of name recognition. But I read every D&D canon hardback that comes out, and I watched all of these Jaws sequels, and they're not blockbuster schlock. They're pretty amazing, and they do some important things in American culture. And so let's take a look at Jaws the Revenge and see what it did. So first of all, it stars Ellen Brody. It actually has the character Ellen Brody. So Matt Brody, played by Roy Schreider, excuse me. He was the original sheriff who killed the first two Jaws. He killed the giant shark at the end of Jaws 1, and he killed the giant shark at the end of Jaws 2, and then he died of a heart attack. But in Jaws the Revenge, Jaws 4, Ellen Brody, his wife, is still around, right? And she has two sons. She has a younger son and an older son who we have literally seen grow up in these movies. That's pretty incredible, right? Now, in Jaws the Revenge, the older brother actually has a wife and children, right? And so this movie is an exploration of how haunted and how much this giant great white shark has impacted the life of Ellen Brody specifically. And what I really love about this is this film is doing representation and telling the story of older women, right? And how when creatures bring violence in their lives, how they're impacted and what that means and what that looks like from a fear perspective and how that drives them and how that impacts their world. And this is a really beautiful look, right? And the reason why I think, as for Dungeons and Dragons, what we need to realize is Dungeons and Dragons has been a haven for many, many marginalized groups, for people of color, for LGBTQ, for women, but that work isn't done, right? What's really interesting is this movie is like, what does it look like when you're older, and looks at the marginalized group of older people. And I think it's the same for Dungeons and Dragons. I think Dungeons and Dragons has far more to do with representation. It's not over. It hasn't reached the final edges, right? And I think it's really exciting that we could see more and better representation in Dungeons and Dragons, exactly the way more and better representation is accomplished in Jaws the Revenge. Every single word you just heard in this video is my humble opinion. Nothing more, nothing less. The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.